Everyone thought he had died in that tragic accident, but the truth was covered up. Miraculously surviving, he was saved by a homeless boy who changed his fate. When he re-emerged before the nation, he brought a revelation that would bring everything his family had built crashing down. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this is going to be the best story you'll ever hear. Chapter 1. When it all falls apart. Night fell over New York City like a heavy shroud, carrying with it the weight of the final hours of a seemingly endless day. The city lights twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the newspaper headlines, on the nightly news broadcasts, and across social media feeds that relentlessly shared the same devastating story. Robert Taylor was gone. The most admired businessman in the country, the man who had built an empire from scratch, who employed thousands of families, and who was synonymous with success and integrity, had perished in a brutal accident on the interstate connecting the city to upstate. The images were shocking. A black Mercedes, completely destroyed, its doors twisted like crumpled paper, the charred metal still smoking as firefighters struggled to control the flames that insisted on reigniting. The scene was heartbreaking. The reporters, their voices heavy with grief, described every detail with an almost religious reverence. There was something unreal about it all, as if life itself had paused to witness the fall of a titan. In the television studios, anchors in dark suits and black ties recounted Robert's journey with the solemnity reserved for history's greatest moments. They showed photos of him as a young man, still fighting to open his first company, smiling with that humble charm that captivated everyone. Then came the images of his rise, the inauguration of the Taylor Holdings headquarters, the Entrepreneur of the Year awards, the magazine covers, the inspiring speeches at corporate events. It was as if they were assembling a scrapbook of someone who no longer belonged to this world. And then the family appeared. Robert's wife, Eleanor Taylor, a woman of impeccable beauty and always elegant posture, appeared before the cameras wrapped in a discreet black dress, her eyes hidden behind enormous dark glasses, despite it being nighttime. She spoke with a choked voice, choosing each word carefully, like someone reciting a script rehearsed 1,000 times before taking the stage. She said beautiful things about her husband, about the legacy he was leaving, about the unbearable pain of losing the love of her life. The tears flowed at the perfect moment, not a second too soon or too late. She dabbed her face with a white silk handkerchief, always maintaining her composure, always looking like the perfect widow. At her side was Gregory Taylor, Robert's brother. The two looked alike physically, but while Robert always had an air of seriousness tempered with kindness, Gregory possessed a harder, more calculating gaze. He also wore black, also spoke of the tragedy with sorrow, but there was something in his gestures that didn't quite match the grief. Perhaps it was the way his eyes darted away from the cameras, or maybe the way his fists clenched every time someone mentioned his brother's name. But no one paid attention to that. After all, everyone deals with loss differently, right? The commotion was nationwide. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, everyone took to social media to offer their condolences. Flowers began to pile up in front of the company headquarters, forming a colorful sea of tributes. Handwritten signs read things like, "Thanks for believing in America, and you will always be remembered." People cried real tears because Robert Taylor wasn't just a rich businessman. He was seen as someone who made a difference, who created jobs, who supported social projects, who believed in people. To many, he was proof that you could succeed with dignity. But while the entire country bowed in mourning, the truth was very different. Far from the spotlights, the newspapers and the cameras, far from everything that represented Robert Taylor's public life, the reality was much crueler and much darker. Robert wasn't gone. Robert was alive, but only technically alive. On a forgotten back road, on the outskirts of Queens, where overgrown vegetation lined the sides and streetlights were few and far between, a body lay on the cold, damp asphalt. The rain had started a few hours earlier, first as a fine mist and then as a violent downpour that washed the blood from the pavement and turned the dirt to mud. The body was lying on its side, arms at odd angles, clothes torn and filthy, face covered in cuts and bruises that were already beginning to swell. It was Robert Taylor. But nobody knew. He had been left there so that no one would ever find him. The road was rarely used, especially at night and in that torrential rain. Cars passed by occasionally, but always at high speed, their drivers focused only on reaching their destination. No one looked to the side. No one stopped. No one cared about what might be lying there, abandoned in the darkness. Robert fought to keep his eyes open. Every breath was a battle. His entire body ached in a way he never imagined possible. He felt as if he'd been hit by a train and then thrown off a cliff. His legs didn't respond to his brain's commands. His arms barely moved. His vision faded in and out, alternating between moments of clarity and a blackness that threatened to swallow him whole. He tried to remember what had happened, but the memories came in fragments like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't assemble. He remembered being in the car. He remembered Charles, his trusted driver, the man who had worked with him for over 10 years and had always been discreet, punctual, and efficient. He remembered leaving the meeting earlier than planned. He remembered falling asleep in the back seat, tired after an intense day of negotiations. And then something strange had happened. Robert couldn't remember exactly what, but he remembered the feeling. A sudden break, a violent jolt, the sound of twisting metal, a sharp pain in his head, and then nothing. When he woke up, he was already there, thrown onto that road, alone, abandoned, and Charles was gone. Simply gone, as if he had never existed. Robert tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. He tried to crawl, but his muscles wouldn't obey. All he could do was lie there, feeling the cold rain soak his body, already numb from the cold, as his consciousness flickered like a light bulb about to burn out. He didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had lost all meaning. All that existed was the pain, the cold, and the growing certainty that this was his end. Here, on this forgotten road, with no one to witness, no one to care. But then, in the midst of that total darkness, something changed. A sound. Light footsteps. A presence. Robert forced his eyes open, even if just a crack. Through the curtain of rain and the fog that blurred his vision, he could make out a small figure approaching. It was a child, a boy. The boy must have been about 12 or 13. It was hard to tell for sure in the dim light. He was thin, almost skeletal, with worn, torn clothes that hung loosely on his small frame. His feet were bare, covered in mud. His matted hair was plastered to his face, wet from the rain. He was carrying a plastic bag, probably full of cans and bottles he had collected throughout the day. The boy stopped when he saw the body on the ground. For a moment, he just stared, as if he didn't know what to do. Robert could see. The fear in the boy's eyes mixed with something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps compassion. The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another. When he got close enough, he knelt beside Robert. The boy reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched the injured man's shoulder. Robert felt that touch like an anchor, pulling him back to reality, keeping him from drowning completely in the darkness. The boy leaned in, observing the wounds, his eyes wide with what he saw. He muttered something, but Robert couldn't understand. Maybe it was just the sound of the rain muffling the words, or maybe it was his own consciousness failing again. And then the boy did something extraordinary. Instead of running away, instead of simply going on his way and leaving this stranger to his fate, he decided to help. Without knowing who this man was, without imagining his importance or his power, moved only by an instinct of humanity that many adults had long since lost. The boy decided he wasn't going to leave someone there to die alone. With a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail, the boy began to drag Robert. Inch by inch he pulled the heavy body across the wet asphalt, stopping every so often to catch his breath and then starting again. It was a Herculean effort for someone so young and malnourished, but the boy didn't give up. There was a fierce determination in those tired eyes, a refusal to accept that this life could simply be extinguished. Robert drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. Sometimes he would open his eyes and see the dark sky above, the raindrops falling like endless tears. Other times, he saw only blackness, but he always felt the constant pull, those small hands gripping his clothes and dragging him to a place he didn't know. After what felt like an eternity, they finally arrived. It was an abandoned bodega, or what was left of one. The walls were peeling, covered in graffiti and moss. Half the roof had collapsed, letting the rain pour in through several openings. The floor was cracked concrete, covered in dirt and debris. But it was shelter. It was better than the road. The boy dragged Robert inside, positioning him in a corner where part of the roof was still intact. Then he ran out and came back with pieces of cardboard, some old rags and even a torn tarp. With these he improvised a sort of bed, placing Robert on the layers of cardboard to insulate him a little from the cold floor. Next, the boy searched through his few belongings. From a bag hidden behind some loose bricks, he pulled out a plastic bottle with murky water and a piece of stale bread. Without hesitation, he offered it all to Robert. The businessman, though weak, managed to take a few sips. The water tasted strange, probably contaminated, but at that moment it was the most precious nectar in the world. The boy then took a relatively clean cloth, wet it with the water, and began to carefully clean Robert's wounds, doing the best he could with the little he had. It was an impossible scene. The richest man in New York, the businessman who commanded multi-million-dollar deals, being cared for by a homeless boy who didn't even have a place to sleep. But there, in that moment, there were no class differences, no money or power. There was only one human being helping another, moved by pure compassion. Robert looked at the boy through half-closed eyes. Even in the dim light, even through the haze of pain, he could see the boy's face. It was a face marked by the harshness of life, by days without enough food, by nights sleeping in the open. But it was also a face illuminated by a rare kindness, by a purity that suffering had not yet managed to completely destroy. The boy noticed Robert was looking at him and gave a small, shy, uncertain smile. It was a smile that said many things without words. It said that everything was okay, that he would take care of this stranger, that there was no need to be afraid. Robert tried to speak, to thank him, but his voice wouldn't come out. All he managed was an almost imperceptible nod, a tiny gesture that he hoped the boy would understand as gratitude. And the boy understood. He nodded back, then sat down next to Robert, leaning his back against the damp wall. They stayed like that for a long time, the injured man lying on the makeshift bed, and the boy standing guard beside him, like an unlikely but incredibly brave protector. Outside, the rain continued to fall hard, washing over the city and erasing any trace of what had happened that terrible night. On television, the news channels kept repeating the same story. Robert Taylor was gone, a national tragedy, an irreparable loss. Eleanor and Gregory continued to receive condolences, sign documents, and reorganize the empire that now belonged to them. They had no idea that just a few miles away, in that forgotten bodega, the man they thought they had eliminated forever was still breathing, still fighting, still clinging to life with the unlikely help of a child who had nothing, but who was willing to give everything. The night was long and cold. Robert alternated between moments of lucidity and delirium. When he was conscious, he felt the excruciating pain in every inch of his body. When he was delirious, he saw confusing images. Eleanor's face, cold and calculating, Gregory's eyes, full of poorly disguised ambition, the figure of Charles, his driver, accepting something from someone in a conversation Robert shouldn't have seen, but did. The fragments of memory began to form a disturbing picture. Robert now remembered small details that had previously seemed insignificant. Gregory's insistence that he sign new documents transferring part of the company's control. Eleanor's growing coldness. In recent weeks, her increasingly frequent absences, her evasive answers when he asked where she had been. Charles's strange behavior that afternoon, the way he avoided Robert's gaze in the rearview mirror. It was all starting to make sense in a horrible, impossible-to-accept way. At dawn, when the first rays of sun pierced through the cracks in the ruined roof, Robert was still alive, barely, but alive. And beside him, sleeping, sitting up with his head resting on his knees, was the boy who had become his unlikely savior. Robert looked at the child and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Not the empty hope of corporate speeches, not the manufactured hope of business meetings. This was real, visceral hope, born from the deep understanding that there were still good people in the world. There was still selfless kindness. There was still a reason to fight. And as the sun rose over New York City, bringing a new day full of fake news and feigned grief, in that abandoned bodega, a simple but powerful truth was also born. Robert Taylor was not going to give up. He was going to survive. He was going to uncover the whole truth. And when the time was right, he was going to get justice. Not for revenge, but because the boy who saved him deserved to see that good could still win, even when all seemed lost. The first chapter of that improbable story was just beginning, and neither Eleanor nor Gregory nor anyone who had conspired against him could imagine what was coming. Chapter 2. Fragments of the Truth. The following days were a constant struggle between life and surrender. Robert floated in a state that was neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, but something in between. It was like being trapped in a limbo where time made no sense and where each moment stretched into an eternity. Pain was his only constant companion, a presence that never left him, reminding him every second that he was still, however barely, alive. The boy never left his side. He slept right there on the hard floor of the bodega, wrapped in old rags that barely protected him from the pre-dawn chill. During the day, he would go out in search of food and water, always returning with what little he could find. Pieces of day-old bread someone had thrown away, bruised fruit no one else wanted, water from a public fountain a few blocks away. It was little, very little, but it was all he had to offer, and he offered it without complaint, without asking for anything in return, without asking who this man was or why he was in such a state. To the boy it was enough to know that someone needed help. The rest didn't matter. Robert watched it all through a haze of fever and pain. He watched as the boy shared the last slice of bread with him, even if it meant going hungry. Himself, he watched as he soaked cloths in cool water and placed them on his feverish forehead, trying to bring his temperature down. He watched as he talked to Robert, even without getting a response, telling him about his day, about the things he saw on the streets, about the dreams he still dared to have. It took 5 full days for Robert to finally manage a word. It was dawn, and the boy had just returned with a bottle of water and a few bananas he had somehow acquired. He knelt beside Robert and began to help him drink, tilting the bottle slowly so he wouldn't choke. And it was then that Robert managed to whisper, in a hoarse voice he barely recognized as his own, "Thank you." The boy almost dropped the bottle in shock. His eyes widened, and a huge smile lit up his thin face. He said nothing, just nodded vigorously, as if that single word was worth more than any elaborate speech. From that day on, Robert began to gradually improve. The fever slowly subsided. His vision became less blurry. His limbs responded better to his brain's commands. He was still a long way from being well, but at least it no longer felt like he was about to slip away at any moment. And as his mind cleared, the questions began to surface. Robert needed to understand who this boy was who had saved him. He needed to know his story, his name, how he had ended up in this life of abandonment. It was one afternoon as the sun streamed through the cracks in the roof, creating patterns of light and shadow on the dusty floor, that Robert finally managed to ask the question that had been on his mind. "What's your name?" The boy was sitting near him, slowly eating a cookie he had somehow gotten. He stopped chewing when he heard Robert's voice, his eyes shining with the surprise of having someone actually talk to him. "Leo," he answered simply, with a shy smile. "My name's Leo." Robert repeated the name in his mind, engraving it as if it were the most important thing in the world. Leo, the name of the boy who had saved his life when his own family had left him for dead. "And you, mister?" Leo asked, with a childlike curiosity that contrasted with the forced maturity that life on the streets had imposed on him. "What's your name?" Robert hesitated. Should he tell the truth? Would it be safe? But looking into those honest eyes, at that face that knew no malice or ulterior motives, he decided that Leo deserved to know. "Robert," he said. "My name is Robert." Leo nodded, clearly not recognizing the name. To him, Robert was just another injured man, not the famous businessman whose supposed death had shaken the entire country. And there was something liberating in that, in being just Robert without all the titles and expectations that came with his last name. In the days that followed, they talked a lot. Or rather, Leo talked and Robert listened, treasuring every word, every detail about this extraordinary boy's life. Leo was 13, about to turn 14 in 2 months. He had been born in a rough neighborhood in the East Bronx, the son of a mother who worked as a housekeeper and a father who had disappeared before he was even born. His mother had done her best to raise him well, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, always struggling to put food on the table and keep the boy in school. But then 2 years ago she had gotten sick. Leo didn't really understand what it was. The adults used complicated words he didn't know, but he knew it was something serious, something that made his mother waste away day by day until one day she simply didn't wake up. With no family and nowhere to go, Leo ended up on the streets. He tried staying in shelters, but he always ended up running away. He said he felt trapped there, watched, as if he had done something wrong just for being poor and alone. On the streets, at least he had freedom. He could come and go as he pleased, even if it meant going hungry and cold. He survived by collecting cans and bottles to sell at scrapyards, doing odd jobs when he could, and sometimes getting food from charitable people who took pity on him. He had learned to fend for himself, to be smart, to know where to find food and shelter when he needed it. That abandoned bodega was one of his favorite hideouts. It was far enough from the bustling city center that no one bothered him, but close enough to an avenue where he could collect recyclables. It was where he kept his few belongings, where he slept on the hardest nights, and it was there that he had brought Robert on that rainy night, acting on instinct, without thinking of the consequences, just knowing that he couldn't leave someone on the road to die. Robert listened to it all with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Admiration for the strength of this boy, who, despite everything he had lost and suffered, still maintained that intact kindness, and sadness to know that there were so many children like Leo, invisible to society, fighting alone in a world that didn't seem to care. But there was another emotion growing inside Robert: guilt. He had spent years immersed in his world of business and profits, so focused on expanding his empire that he had completely lost touch with the reality of most people. How many times had he driven past children on the street and simply looked away as if they weren't his problem? How many times had he dined in expensive restaurants while people were starving just outside the window? Leo had given him a lesson in humanity that no MBA, course or corporate seminar could ever teach. As the days passed and Robert regained his strength, he began to pay more attention to what was happening around him. And it was Leo who started bringing information that would make everything make terrible sense. The boy had a habit of exploring the area, always on the lookout for anything useful. And on one of these excursions, he had noticed something strange. There were men hanging around the area. They weren't homeless like he was used to seeing, nor were they ordinary workers. They were well-dressed men in suits and shiny shoes, clearly out of place in this forgotten neighborhood. Leo told Robert how he had hidden behind a wall while 2 of these men talked near a black car. They spoke quietly, looking around nervously, but the boy had sharp hearing and managed to catch snippets of the conversation. One of them said something about making sure there were no survivors. The other replied that yes, it was all taken care of, that the body would never be found. Then they mentioned something about money, about bank transfers that could finally be made without any obstacles. And then one of them said a name that made Robert's blood run cold: Gregory. They said that Gregory was pleased with the job and that there would be an extra bonus for everyone involved. When Leo finished his story, the silence in the bodega was heavy and oppressive. Robert closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of rage and pain that went far beyond his physical injuries. It was a pain that cut to the soul, the pain of betrayal by his own blood, the pain of discovering that his own brother had planned his end. But why, Leo asked with the innocence of someone who hadn't yet been completely corrupted by the world's evil. Why would someone do that? Robert took a moment to answer. When he finally did, his voice was laden with a bitterness he didn't know he was capable of feeling. For money, Leo. For power. For greed. The same things that make people forget what's right and wrong. And then Robert began to tell the boy his story. He told him about his business empire, about the years of hard work to build it all from scratch. He told him about Gregory, his younger brother, who had always lived in his shadow, always resentful of not being the firstborn, always envious of Robert's success. He told him about Eleanor, the wife he had loved deeply, who he now realized had perhaps never returned that love in the same way. Leo listened with wide eyes, trying to process the magnitude of a story that seemed straight out of a TV drama. But it was real, terribly and painfully real. In the following days, Leo became Robert's eyes and ears in the outside world. The boy went out every day, discreetly watching those mysterious men, mentally noting everything he saw and heard. It was risky, and Robert worried about the boy's safety, but Leo insisted. He said that after everything Robert was going through, the least he could do was help, and the information Leo brought back was increasingly disturbing. The men kept showing up. Sometimes it was the same ones, sometimes different ones, but they all seemed to be looking for something, or checking to make sure there was really nothing there. Leo heard them mention Gregory's name again, and also a woman they called Eleanor. They talked about secret meetings, about signed documents, about how easily everything had been executed. It was on a particularly hot afternoon, when the sun turned the bodega into an oven, that Leo brought the most shocking piece of information. He had followed one of the men to a nearby cafe, keeping his distance, but always watching. The man had met with another, and Leo managed to sit at a nearby table, pretending to be engrossed in an old book he had found in the trash. And then he heard it. He heard one of them say that Charles, the driver, was hiding out somewhere upstate. They said he had received a generous sum for his services, but that it was better to keep him away until things completely settled down. One of them laughed, saying that Charles had been brilliant in how he had caused the accident without leaving any evidence of his involvement. Leo repeated every word to Robert, watching as the face of the man he had saved hardened into an expression of deep pain. It wasn't just the physical pain of his still healing wounds. It was the pain of a threefold betrayal: a brother, a wife, and a trusted employee, all united in a conspiracy to eliminate him. So why did they leave you alive? Leo asked, his small voice breaking the heavy silence that had fallen. Robert thought for a long moment before answering. They don't know I'm alive, Leo. They think they left me there to die. That must be why they didn't confirm. They left believing I wouldn't survive, and if you hadn't found me, they would have been right. The boy moved closer and gently touched Robert's shoulder, a simple gesture laden with meaning. But I did find you, he said with conviction, and you're going to be okay. We're going to figure everything out and do what's right. Robert looked at the 13-year-old boy, at this child who should have been worried only about games and school, but who was instead here, caring for a stranger and risking himself to help unravel a dangerous conspiracy. And he felt his heart tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. True love, not the self-serving, conditional love he received from those around him, but the pure, selfless love of someone who gives without expecting anything in return. You're brave, Leo, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, braver than many grown men I know. Leo shrugged as if it were no big deal. My mum always said you have to help when you can. She said the world only gets better if everyone does their part, even if it's small. Robert felt his eyes sting. Leo's mother, a woman he would never meet, who had worked herself to exhaustion to give her son a decent life, had managed to teach the boy values that many rich and powerful people would never learn. She was right, Robert said. Your mother was a wise woman. Leo smiled, a sad but proud smile. She was. I miss her. Every day. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, New York City continued its frantic pace, indifferent to the drama unfolding in that forgotten bodega. The news about Robert Taylor had already faded from the main headlines, replaced by other, more recent scandals and tragedies. To the world, he was already just a memory, an archived obituary, a sad story people mentioned in passing but quickly forgot. But here, in this unlikely hideout, Robert was very much alive, and more than that, he was starting to plan. It wasn't time yet to reveal that he had survived. He needed to be patient, strategic. He needed to gather irrefutable proof before making any move, and for that, he would need help. It was then that Robert remembered Dr. Arthur Miller, an old friend from his college days. Arthur was a doctor, a respected surgeon who had stepped away from the limelight after retiring a few years earlier. But more importantly, Arthur was someone Robert could trust implicitly. They had been through a lot together, and Robert knew that if there was one person in the world who would help him without asking inconvenient questions, it was him. The problem was how to contact him without alerting the traitors. Any phone call could be traced, any message could be intercepted. Robert needed to think of a secure way to communicate, and it was Leo, once again, who came up with the solution. The boy knew an old man who worked at a nearby used bookstore, a place that sold second-hand books. The man was kind, always giving Leo old books to read when he stopped by. Leo suggested he could ask the man to make an anonymous call to Dr. Miller, setting up a discreet meeting in a place that only Robert and the doctor would know. It was risky, but it was the best option they had. And so, on the 15th day since the accident, the plan was set in motion. Leo left early that morning, carrying a piece of paper on which Robert had scribbled precise instructions. The boy returned hours later with the news that the call had been made and that Dr. Miller had agreed to meet at the designated spot that very night. Robert felt a mix of anxiety and hope. Arthur was the key to his full recovery. With proper medical treatment, he could speed up his healing and start working more actively on his plan to reveal the truth. When night fell, Robert did something he hadn't done in weeks. He stood up. His legs trembled like jelly, and the pain was intense, but he managed to get to his feet. Leo stood by his side, ready to catch him if he fell. Together, slowly, they left the bodega for the first time. The cool night air of the city had never felt so invigorating. Robert took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air that tasted of freedom and a second chance. The meeting spot was a small abandoned park a few blocks away. Leo had checked it earlier to make sure it was deserted. And there, sitting on a bench under the dim light of a lamppost, was Dr. Arthur Miller. The doctor stood up as soon as he saw them approaching. His expression shifted from confusion to absolute shock when he recognized Robert. He ran towards them, his eyes disbelieving what they were seeing. "Robert, my God, Robert," he whispered, his voice trembling. We all thought that you were gone." Robert smiled faintly, leaning on Leo. "Almost, Arthur. I was almost gone, but this boy saved me, and now I need your help." Chapter 3. Gathering the Evidence. Dr. Arthur Miller didn't ask any questions that first night. His priority was to assess Robert's condition and begin proper treatment as quickly as possible. With experienced hands and a clinical eye, he examined every wound, every bruise, every bone that still ached to the touch. The diagnosis wasn't encouraging, but it wasn't a death sentence either. Robert had suffered multiple rib fractures, a moderate concussion, several deep lacerations, and a severe contusion to his hip. The fact that he was alive and conscious after 2 weeks without proper medical care was nothing short of a miracle. "I'll need to bring some supplies," Arthur said, still processing the whole situation. "Antibiotics, painkillers, proper dressing materials. I can't take you to a hospital, I assume." Robert shook his head. Any official move would alert exactly the wrong people. "I understand," the doctor replied, not pressing for explanations. "I'll handle everything discreetly, but you're going to need time, Robert. Time and rest. This won't be a quick recovery." Thus began a new phase in this improbable story. Dr. Miller became the third member of their secret alliance, visiting the bodega every night, always discreet, always bringing what was needed to treat Robert properly. He never arrived at the same time, never took the same route twice, always checked to make sure he wasn't being followed. He was a man of science, but he was also a man who understood the gravity of the situation. With proper treatment, Robert's recovery accelerated significantly. The fevers stopped. The wounds began to heal correctly. The pain, though still present, became more manageable with the medication Arthur brought. Within 3 weeks, Robert could walk without support. though he still limped and needed to take frequent breaks. And as his body healed, his mind grew stronger. Robert began to devise a meticulous plan. It wasn't enough to survive. It wasn't enough to simply reappear and shout to the world that he was alive. He needed concrete, irrefutable proof that would expose not just the betrayal, but the full extent of the conspiracy that had been orchestrated against him. Leo continued to be his eyes and ears on the streets. The boy had developed an impressive knack for observing without being noticed, for overhearing conversations without drawing attention, for following people without arousing suspicion. It was as if his hard life on the streets had taught him skills that were now proving invaluable. It was through Leo that Robert discovered Eleanor and Gregory had moved into his house, claiming it was too painful for the widow to continue living in her previous home, filled with memories. The truth, Robert knew, was that this house was 3 times larger and far more luxurious. The two had already taken complete control of his empire, signing documents that transferred stocks and properties into their names. Leo also found out where Charles, the traitorous driver, was hiding. It was a small, secluded house upstate, about a 2-hour drive from the city. The man was living quietly on the money he had received for his betrayal, thinking he was safe, that his role in this terrible story would never be discovered. But discovery wasn't enough. Robert needed tangible proof, and that's when Dr. Miller had an idea. Arthur had a nephew who worked in tech, a brilliant young man specializing in digital security and data recovery. The young man, named Daniel, was discreet and loyal to his family. Arthur suggested he could help Robert remotely access systems that would contain the necessary evidence. Robert hesitated at first. Involving another person meant more risk. But he soon realized he had no choice. He didn't have the technical skills to do it himself, and time was a luxury he didn't have. Daniel was carefully brought into the plan. The young man, in his mid-20s, was initially shocked to learn that Robert Taylor was alive, but he quickly grasped the seriousness of the situation and committed to helping. There was something in him, a moral outrage at the injustice, that made him want to see this story end the right way. A small operations center was set up inside the bodega. Daniel brought an old but functional laptop, powered by a portable battery he recharged daily. With this simple equipment, he began to work his digital magic. The first target was the banking systems. Daniel managed to discreetly access Gregory and Eleanor's accounts, tracing a detailed map of all the suspicious financial transactions that had occurred in recent weeks. $1 million transfers made days after Robert's supposed death, deposits into offshore accounts, payments to shell companies that, with a little more investigation, were revealed to be linked to Charles and the men Leo had seen lurking in the area. It was like assembling a macabre puzzle. Each piece revealed a little more of the carefully constructed plot. Robert looked at the numbers on the laptop screen and felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. Millions of dollars were being siphoned off, an estate he had built over decades being plundered by people he had trusted. But the financial evidence, however damning, wasn't enough. Robert wanted more. He wanted to capture the traitors' voices, to record their confessions, to have evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. And that's how the boldest part of the plan came about. Daniel discovered that Gregory and Eleanor met every Wednesday in the office that had once belonged to Robert, now completely under their control. The meetings always took place late at night, when there were no more employees at the company headquarters. It was there that they discussed their plans, reviewed their schemes, and congratulated each other on the success of their betrayal. Daniel suggested he could hack into the building's security system and remotely activate the microphones in the intercoms and surveillance cameras. It would be possible to record everything said in those meetings without anyone suspecting a thing. It was risky. If they were discovered, the entire plan would fall apart. But Robert knew he needed that evidence. He needed to hear from the traitors' own mouths the confirmation of what they had done, the details of the conspiracy, the raw, unfiltered truth. The operation was planned with meticulous care. Daniel would spend the entire night working to ensure the access was untraceable. Robert, Leo, and Arthur would wait in the bodega, ready to act if anything went wrong. The first Wednesday was a test. Daniel managed to activate the system without any issues, but Gregory and Eleanor barely spoke that day, focused only on reviewing documents and signing papers. Nothing of value was recorded. The second week, they had better luck. Charles had shown up for the meeting, coming in from upstate especially for it, and there, in the office that had once been Robert's sanctuary, the three conspirators talked freely, believing they were completely safe. Robert listened to everything through headphones connected to the laptop. Every word was a stab to his heart, but he forced himself to keep listening, to record every second of that monstrous conversation. Gregory spoke with an excitement Robert had never seen in his brother before. He laughed, telling jokes about how much easier it had all been than they had imagined. He said Robert had always been too naive, too trusting, that he had never suspected a thing even when the evidence was right in front of his nose. Eleanor chimed in, her voice cold and calculating. She talked about how easy it had been to manipulate Robert emotionally, to get him to sign important documents without reading them carefully, to distract him with promises of renewing their marriage while she and Gregory prepared everything behind the scenes. And Charles, the driver Robert had literally trusted with his life, recounted the details of the accident as if it were a funny anecdote. How he had tampered with the car's brakes days before, how he had chosen that specific road because he knew it was rarely used, how he had pretended to be injured too, screaming for help, just to make sure no one would suspect him. He also confessed that he had returned hours later, once the rain had passed, to check if the body was still there. When he didn't find Robert, he assumed wild animals or someone had taken the body and decided it was best not to mention it to Gregory and Eleanor. After all, the end result was the same. Robert was gone, and everyone believed he was dead. The recording lasted almost 2 hours. When it finally ended, Robert's eyes were red, not with tears, but with pure, controlled rage. He had heard everything. He now held a complete, detailed confession, recorded in high-quality digital audio. But it wasn't time to act yet. There was one more element Robert wanted to add to his dossier of evidence. Through Daniel, he managed to access Eleanor and Gregory's personal emails. There, he found messages exchanged between them in the months leading up to the accident, planning every detail, discussing how they would divide the empire, even joking about what the public's reaction would be when the news broke. There were also emails to lawyers, instructing them on how to prepare documents that would facilitate the transfer of assets. Messages to financial advisors about the best way to move large sums of money without arousing suspicion from the authorities. A veritable manual on how to commit an elaborate betrayal and try to get away with it. Each piece of evidence was carefully copied, archived, and prepared for the final presentation. Daniel created multiple backup copies, stored in different locations and on different devices. There could be no risk of losing this evidence. Meanwhile, Robert was also working on another aspect of his plan, preparing for his physical return. He needed to be strong enough to endure the emotional marathon that would come when he finally revealed himself. Arthur helped him with improvised physical therapy exercises, strengthening his atrophied muscles, working on the mobility that had been compromised by his injuries. Leo, always helpful, had managed to get Robert suitable clothes. They weren't the designer suits he was used to, but they were clean and respectable. The boy had also taken it upon himself to make the businessman presentable, helping him cut his hair and trim the beard that had grown wild during his weeks of recovery. It was amazing to see how this 13-year-old boy had taken on so many responsibilities. He organized the hideout, kept everything as clean as possible, and made sure there was always food and water. But more than the practical tasks, Leo offered something Robert didn't know he needed so badly: genuine companionship. They talked a lot during those days. Robert told stories from his life, but not the glamorized versions that always appeared in magazines. He talked about the real challenges, the failures that preceded the successes, the moments of doubt and fear he had never publicly admitted. And Leo listened intently, sometimes asking insightful questions that surprised Robert with their maturity. The boy also began to talk more about his mother, about the lessons she had taught him, about the dreams she had for his future. Simple but profound dreams, that he would get an education, have a respectable profession, and be a good man. She always said it didn't matter if he became rich or poor, as long as he kept his integrity intact. Hearing this, Robert realized something fundamental. Leo's mother, a woman who probably never had much more than what was necessary to survive, had managed to raise a better, more upstanding, and more human son than he himself had been for much of his life. She had given the boy values that all the money in the world couldn't buy. And Robert made a silent promise to himself. When this was all over, when the truth came out and he reclaimed his place in the world, he would make sure Leo had everything his mother had dreamed of for him. Not out of pity, not out of charity, but because the boy deserved it. Because he had proven through his selfless actions that he was worthy of every opportunity life could offer. Another 3 weeks of meticulous preparation passed. Robert was now almost fully recovered physically. The pain still lingered, but it was manageable. He could walk, normally speak clearly, and think with the same sharpness he always had. The dossier of evidence was complete. Audio recordings, financial documents, incriminating emails, all meticulously organized and prepared to be presented in a way that would be impossible to contest or refute. The time had come to plan his return. Robert wanted it to be public, something that would leave no doubt, something that would force the traitors to face the consequences of their actions before the entire country. He decided to organize a press conference, summoning the main media outlets for what would be announced as a major statement on the future of Taylor Holdings. Gregory and Eleanor would certainly attend, thinking it was just another opportunity to solidify their position as the new leaders of the company. They would have no idea what awaited them. Daniel would be responsible for ensuring everything was broadcast live, with no possibility of censorship or interruption. He had already contacted trusted journalists, planting the seed that something big was about to happen, ensuring maximum coverage. Arthur would be present, not just for moral support but also as a medical witness, someone who could attest to Robert's condition when he was found and the treatment required to save him. And Leo, the boy who had started it all with a simple act of kindness, would be there too. Robert was absolutely insistent on this. The country needed to know this extraordinary boy, needed to know that it was a child who had saved one of the most powerful men in the country when his own family had betrayed him. The night before the scheduled conference, Robert couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of the bodega that had been his refuge for so many weeks. He thought about everything. He had been through, how his life had changed so drastically and unexpectedly. There was something liberating in it all, he realized. Yes, it had been a terrible and painful experience. Yes, he had discovered betrayals he never imagined possible. But he had also discovered truths about himself, about what really mattered in life, about the value of genuine human connections. Leo slept nearby, wrapped in a blanket Arthur had brought. The boy slept peacefully, the sleep of someone who knows they have done the right thing, who can rest with a clear conscience. Robert looked at him and felt a paternal love he had never experienced before, not even when he had considered the possibility of having children with Eleanor. This boy changed my life, Robert thought. He saved me in a way that goes far beyond the physical. He showed me there was still goodness in the world, that there was still hope, that there was still a reason to believe in people. And tomorrow, the whole world would know Leo's story. The country would meet the boy who saved Robert Taylor. And Robert would make sure that Leo's life changed forever, just as Leo had changed his. When the sun rose on that last morning in the bodega, Robert felt a mix of nervousness and determination. It was time to go back. It was time to face the traitors. It was time for justice. Leo woke up and smiled when he saw him already dressed and ready. The boy also got ready quickly, putting on the new clothes Daniel had brought for him. They were simple but respectable, perfect for the occasion. "I'm scared," Leo confessed as they prepared to leave. Robert knelt to be at the boy's level and placed his hands on his shoulders. "I am too, Leo, but fear only paralyzes us if we let it, and we're not going to let it. We're going to go out there, we're going to tell the truth, and we're going to show that good can still win." The boy nodded, his expression becoming more determined. Together, they left the bodega for the last time. Daniel was already waiting with a discreet car. Arthur was in the back seat, nervous but prepared. As the vehicle made its way through the streets of New York toward the conference venue, Robert looked out the window, observing the city he had so often crossed without truly seeing. Now, after everything he had been through, Every detail seemed different, more real, more significant. The game was about to change, and Robert Taylor was ready for his resurrection. Chapter 4. The Truth Returns. The auditorium of the Grand Astoria Hotel in the heart of Manhattan was packed. Cameras from every major television network were strategically positioned, ready to capture every moment of what had been billed as a major press conference on the future of Taylor Holdings. Journalists filled the front rows, their recorders and laptops at the ready. Business leaders, curious onlookers, and even a few politicians had shown up, intrigued by the mystery surrounding the event. In the front row, standing out for their impeccable posture and the mourning clothes they still wore, were Eleanor and Gregory Taylor. She wore an elegant black dress, understated but clearly expensive. He wore a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted. Both wore the look of studied solemnity they had perfected over the past few weeks. The mask of the grieving widow and brother that had fooled the entire country. Gregory was speaking quietly to Eleanor, speculating about the reason for the summons. They had been informed by their lawyers that their presence was required, that there were legal matters regarding the company's succession to be addressed publicly. Neither of them suspected a thing. After all, Robert was definitively out of the picture. They had seen the wrecked car, organized the symbolic funeral, and shed false tears for the cameras. It was all settled, or so they thought. Backstage, in a private room far from prying eyes, Robert was making the final adjustments to his presentation. He was nervous, he couldn't deny it. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the documents he was about to present. But it wasn't the nervousness of fear. It was the adrenaline of someone about to deliver justice, the almost electric energy that precedes a historic moment. Leo was by his side, dressed in the simple but respectable clothes Daniel had provided. The boy held Robert's hand, offering the silent support that had become so essential in recent weeks. His eyes shone with a mixture of anxiety and pride. He knew what was about to happen, and even though he was scared, he knew it was the right thing to do. Dr. Miller was double-checking the medical documents that attested to the state in which Robert had been found. Daniel was making the final tweaks to the broadcast system, ensuring everything would be streamed live with no possibility of interruption. Every detail had been meticulously planned. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the dot, the auditorium lights dimmed. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. The cameras adjusted, focusing on the stage where a lectern had been set up, flanked by 2 enormous screens where the evidence would be projected. The event's host, a company lawyer who had no idea what was about to unfold, walked onto the stage and began his standard opening, thanking everyone for their attendance and explaining that there would be an important announcement about the future of Taylor Holdings. And then he spoke the words that would make the event historic. "It is with great surprise and joy that I announce to you that the person making this statement is someone we all thought we had tragically lost. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Taylor." The silence that fell over the auditorium was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. No one moved, no one breathed. All eyes were fixed on the side of the stage from where the speaker was expected to emerge. Eleanor felt her heart stop. Her hands, which had been resting elegantly in her lap, clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Beside her, Gregory was rigid, his face drained of all color. They exchanged a look of pure panic but had no time to process what it meant. Because at that moment, walking with a firm and dignified stride, Robert Taylor stepped onto the stage. It was him. Undeniably, unquestionably him. A little thinner with a few visible scars on his face, but definitely alive and present. He wore a simple but elegant suit, his posture erect and confident. By his side, holding his hand with a courage that was astonishing for someone so young, was Leo. The auditorium erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Camera flashes went off incessantly. People were crying, others were screaming in shock and joy. It was a controlled chaos of intense emotions. Eleanor was paralyzed, her mask of the perfect widow visibly cracking. Gregory tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. He collapsed back into his chair, his face now not just pale, but a nauseous shade of green. Robert raised a hand, calling for silence. It took a few minutes, but eventually the crowd quieted down enough for him to speak. His voice, when it finally came, was firm and clear, amplified by the auditorium's state-of-the-art sound system. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice filled with controlled emotion. "I know my presence here today is a surprise. I myself still find it hard to believe that I'm alive and able to speak with you." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence was so intense you could hear the hum of the cameras. "You must be wondering where I've been for the past few weeks, how I survived the accident that was reported nationwide. And I am here today to tell you the truth, the whole truth, with no omissions, no half-truths." Robert took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the auditorium until they landed on Eleanor and Gregory. The look he gave them was not one of hatred, but of a deep sadness mixed with determination. "The accident you saw in the news was not an accident," he said, and the entire room held its breath. "It was a deliberate and planned attempt on my life, a conspiracy orchestrated by the people I trusted more than anyone else in the world." The cameras immediately swiveled to focus on Eleanor and Gregory. Both were visibly in shock, Eleanor trying to maintain some semblance of composure, while Gregory looked on the verge of collapse. Robert nodded to Daniel, who was controlling the presentation. The first screen lit up, displaying detailed financial documents. "This is evidence of bank transfers made days after my supposed death," Robert explained, his voice steady. "Millions of dollars moved from company accounts to personal accounts, to offshore havens, to shell companies. All while the country was mourning me." Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The television cameras captured every detail of the projected documents. "But that's just the beginning," Robert continued, "because I didn't come here today with just financial proof. I came with something much more powerful. I came with the raw, unvarnished truth, recorded in the conspirators' own words." He gave another signal to Daniel. The auditorium speakers began to play the audio from the meeting recorded weeks earlier. Gregory's voice echoed through the space, clear and unmistakable, laughing as he described how easy it had been to deceive Robert. Then came Eleanor's voice, cold and calculating, detailing how she had emotionally manipulated her husband, and finally, Charles, the driver, confessing the technical details of how he had sabotaged the car. The audio played for 10 minutes, 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. When it finally ended, the silence in the auditorium was sepulchral. It wasn't just shock, it was horror, revulsion, outrage. Eleanor had buried her face in her hands. Gregory was hunched over as if he'd been punched in the gut. There was no way to deny it, no way to justify it. Their own voices condemned them irrefutably. Robert continued, his voice now filled with a deeper emotion. "But this story isn't just about betrayal and greed. It's also about kindness, about compassion, about the humanity that still exists, even in the most unlikely of places." He turned to Leo, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder with affection and pride. "When I was abandoned on that road, left for dead, I would have died if it weren't for this extraordinary boy. Leo found me when I was already unconscious, gravely injured with no real chance of survival. And he, a child who lives on the streets, who has practically nothing to his name, decided to help me." Robert's voice broke for a moment. He cleared his throat, his eyes shining with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Leo dragged me to shelter. He cared for me with the little he had. He shared his food and water with me, even if it meant going hungry himself. He cleaned my wounds, stayed by my side day and night, and protected me when I was completely vulnerable. And he did all of this without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return. He saved me simply because it was the right thing to do." Leo was crying silently, tears streaming down his thin face. But they were tears of emotion, of pride, of relief at finally seeing the truth being told. The audience was completely captivated. Many were also crying. There was something profoundly moving about the story, a brutal contrast between the greed of the powerful and the selfless kindness of a child. Robert took a handkerchief and gently wiped Leo's tears before continuing. "While my own family was plotting my demise for the money and power I would leave behind, it was this child, who had nothing, who gave me everything. He gave me hope. He gave me a reason to fight. He showed me that genuine goodness still exists in the world. He turned back to the audience, his expression now more serious. Today I didn't just come here to expose a conspiracy, though that is necessary and just. I also came to make an announcement that is more important than any business deal or financial transaction I have ever made in my entire career. Robert knelt beside Leo, bringing himself to the boy's level, took both of the boy's hands in his, looking directly into his eyes. Leo, you saved me in a way that goes far beyond the physical. You showed me what truly matters in life. And for that, in front of this entire country, I want to say that you are not just my savior. You are my family, my real family. The boy sobbed, throwing his arms around Robert in a tight hug. The businessman embraced him, holding him close, letting his own tears finally fall freely. The scene was heartbreaking. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting it to millions of homes across the country. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Even hardened journalists were discreetly wiping their faces. When they finally separated, Robert stood up, still holding Leo's hand. From this day forward, he continued, Leo will have everything he deserves and everything his wonderful mother, who is sadly no longer with us, dreamed for him. He will have an education, a home, opportunities. He will be protected and cared for, not out of charity, but because he has proven through his selfless actions that he is worthy of every blessing life can offer. The auditorium erupted in applause. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt standing ovation. Everyone was on their feet, clapping, many still crying. It was a moment of collective catharsis, of relief at seeing that justice still existed in the world, that good could triumph over evil. Robert let the applause continue for a few minutes before asking for silence again. As for those who conspired against me, he said, looking directly at Eleanor and Gregory, I do not seek revenge. I seek justice. All the evidence I have presented here today has been turned over to the proper authorities. It is not I who will decide your fate. The law will, but I want you to know that despite everything you have done, I forgive you, because I have learned through Leo's example that holding on to hatred only poisons our own souls. Eleanor finally lifted her face. She was destroyed, her makeup smeared by tears, all that veneer of sophistication completely shattered. Gregory couldn't even look at his brother. He kept his head down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Security guards were already moving toward them. Investigators who had received the evidence beforehand were present at the event, ready to act. There would be no escape. Robert continued, his voice now softer, more reflective. This experience has changed me profoundly. It showed me that I had lost sight of what truly matters. I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot to build real human connections. I surrounded myself with people who were interested in what I had, not who I was. He squeezed Leo's hand. But this boy taught me again the value of compassion, of selfless kindness, of true loyalty. And because of that, from this day forward, my life and my work will have a different purpose. Robert paused, letting everyone absorb his words. I will rebuild Taylor Holdings on new principles, absolute transparency, real social responsibility, not just marketing, and I will create a foundation dedicated specifically to helping homeless children, children like Leo, who deserve opportunities but have been forgotten by society. More applause, more tears. It was a historic moment, not just for the revelation of the conspiracy, but for the promise of genuine transformation. Robert concluded his speech by looking directly into the cameras, knowing that millions were watching. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this story, it is this. Never underestimate the power of an act of kindness. Leo saved me with a simple gesture, moved only by compassion. And that gesture not only saved my life, but it completely transformed who I am. Each of us has the power to make a difference in someone's life. Each of us can choose to be the light in someone else's darkness, and I promise from the bottom of my heart that I will dedicate the rest of my life to honoring the gift that Leo gave me, the gift of a second chance. He bowed, holding Leo by his side. The ovation that followed was deafening. People were crying openly, clapping thunderously, shouting words of support and encouragement. In the days that followed, the story of Robert and Leo dominated every headline. The recording of the press conference went viral, shared millions of times on social media. The entire country debated values, the true meaning of family, and how power and money can corrupt even the most sacred bonds. Eleanor and Gregory were formally charged. The evidence was so overwhelming that there was no possibility of a real defense. Charles was also arrested, captured upstate where he thought he was. Safe? The three would face trial for their crimes, and justice would run its course. Taylor Holdings underwent a complete restructuring. Robert took back control, but this time with a completely different vision. He implemented policies of transparency unprecedented in the American corporate world. He created social responsibility programs that actually made a difference, not just existed on paper. And the foundation he had promised to create, named the Leo Hope Foundation, became a reality in record time. It started by serving 50 homeless children, offering shelter, education, psychological support, and job training. In the first year, that number grew to 200. In the second, 500. And it kept growing. Leo, for his part, flourished in his new environment. Robert didn't officially adopt him through paperwork and courts. That felt too cold for the bond they shared. But in practice, in every way that truly mattered, Leo was his son. He lived in Robert's house, attended one of the best private schools in New York City, and had every opportunity his mother had dreamed for him. But most importantly, Leo kept his essence. He didn't let the sudden wealth corrupt him. He remained that kind, compassionate boy. He regularly visited the Leo Hope Foundation, talking to other homeless children, sharing his story to inspire them. He understood, in a way few could, that he had been given an extraordinary opportunity, and he felt a responsibility to honor it by helping others. Robert watched Leo grow with a pride he never thought he was capable of feeling. He saw the boy studying diligently, making genuine friends, dreaming of a bright future. And every night when he went to sleep, he silently thanked that extraordinary child who had saved him not just from a physical death, but from the spiritual death that had begun to consume him. They kept up the habit of returning once a month to that abandoned bodega. It was no longer a place of abandonment and neglect. Robert had bought the property and turned it into a community center, offering free services to the neighborhood's neediest residents. But he made sure to preserve a part of the original structure, just as it was, as a memorial to those difficult but transformative days. It was there that the two would sit, usually in silence, just absorbing the meaning of the place. It was there they had met, two lost souls who had saved each other. It was there that an unlikely friendship had blossomed into a true family. During one of these visits, almost a year after that historic press conference, Leo looked at Robert and asked a question he had been holding on to for a long time. "Do you think your life would be better if none of this had happened, if the attempt on your life was never made?" Robert thought for a long moment before answering. It was a complex question, layered with meaning. "No," he finally replied, "I don't, because if none of this had happened, I would probably still be living that empty life surrounded by fake people, completely disconnected from what really matters. I would have never met you. I would have never learned the lessons I learned. I would have never become the person I am today." He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "That terrible experience gave me the greatest gift I have ever received. You. And through you, I rediscovered my own humanity." Leo smiled, that shy but genuine smile that Robert had learned to cherish so much. "My mom used to say that sometimes God lets bad things happen so that good things can be born. I think she was right." Robert nodded, feeling his eyes sting with tears he was no longer ashamed to let fall. "Your mother was a very wise woman, Leo, and she raised an extraordinary son. I only wish she could see the incredible man you're becoming." They stayed there for a few more hours, talking about everything and nothing, planning the future, remembering the past, simply enjoying each other's company. When they finally left, the sun was setting over New York, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. And as they walked back to the car together, father and son not by blood but by choice and love, Robert thought about how strange and wonderful life was. How the worst moments can lead to the best. How the deepest darkness can reveal the brightest light. How a simple act of kindness can not only change one life, but create waves of transformation that touch countless others. Eleanor and Gregory had tried to take everything from him, and ironically, in doing so, they had given him something that all his money and power could never buy: a real family, a true purpose, and a life worth living. The story of Robert Taylor and Leo Miller, as the newspapers began to call them, became legendary. It was the subject of documentaries, articles, even a movie that raised funds for the Leo Hope Foundation. But for the two protagonists, it wasn't a story. It was simply their lives intertwined in an unexpected but profoundly meaningful way. Years later, when Leo was a young adult studying medicine with the goal of helping underserved communities, he would look back and fully understand the magnitude of what had happened. He hadn't just saved a man on that rainy night. He had saved himself too, pulling himself from a potentially bleak future and opening the door to possibilities he never imagined were possible. And Robert, watching Leo graduate, seeing him become the compassionate and dedicated doctor he dreamed of being, felt his heart overflow with gratitude. Gratitude for that extraordinary boy. Gratitude for the second chance life had given him. Gratitude for having learned, even in the most painful way possible, that a person's true worth isn't measured by what they own, but by what they are willing to give. The bodega where it all began remained a physical reminder of that transformation. And on days when both Robert and Leo felt overwhelmed by life's challenges, it was to that place they returned. They would sit in the same corner where Leo had cared for Robert during those first terrible nights, and they would remember that they had survived the worst. And if they had survived that, they could survive anything. Because in the end, this story wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about redemption. It was about how love and kindness can emerge from the most unlikely places. It was about how a child, with nothing, taught a man who had everything what truly matters. And that lesson, transmitted through the simple act of a child helping a stranger on a rainy night, would echo for generations, inspiring countless others to choose compassion over indifference, kindness over cruelty, and love over selfishness. Robert Taylor's empire would continue to exist and thrive, but now built on entirely different foundations. And by his side, guiding his decisions, always reminding him of what truly matters, would be Leo, the boy who saved much more than a life on that rainy night. Because sometimes, true fortune isn't found in a bank vault. It's found in the connections we make, the lives we touch, and the love we share. And in that respect, Robert Taylor had become the richest man in the world.